We both have relatives, and most of us know people dealing with this issue and how painful it is.
It is literally the slow and gradual death of neurons, namely brain cells. Whilst cancer and heart disease are serious conditions, you can still look through photos of your grandchildren. You're still the person you were. You still have the memories to share together, whereas that is denied you if you have dementia. And so this very slow disorientation and disconnect with the real world. I too have someone very close. My own mum has it.
And that's really the subject of what we're going to be talking about today, because she is a world expert on neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's. Hello and welcome to the Enjoy Life Healthier podcast. I'm Jason Kam. We have an absolutely fascinating podcast for you today. We've got an amazing guest. We're being joined by Professor Baroness Susan Greenfield. She is a professor at Oxford University. She's published over 200 peer-reviewed studies in her long and illustrious career. She's the founder of NeuroBio, an amazing pharmaceutical company that's exploring new options to treat and prevent Alzheimer's disease and neurodegeneration. And that's really the subject of what we're going to be talking about today, because she is a world expert on neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's. And a lot of people out there have a lot of questions, I'm sure. I want to cover as much ground as we can, Dr. Greenfield. So why don't we jump right in and start with an overview question. What is neurodegeneration?
Well, first of all, hello, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a spectre that haunts us all, so I think this is very timely, and I'm very grateful to share the thoughts in this conversation. So what is neurodegeneration? It is literally the slow and gradual death of neurons, namely brain cells. What we know of the neurodegenerative disorders, the main ones are Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and what you in the States called ALS, we call it motor neuron disease in the UK. And although there's other diseases of the brain and there's conditions such as Huntington's chorea, these neurodegenerative disorders do share, we would argue, a common mechanism. And they present with different symptoms. For example, Parkinson's disease presents with a poverty of movement and tremor, muscle rigidity. Motor neuron disease, ALS, presents eventually with very muscle weakness, not being able to move. But eventually, Alzheimer's disease, which I think you're going to talk about most, is dementia. And dementia is characterized by increasing confusion, disorientation. People tend to think it's loss of memory, but it's more than just not remembering what you did last week. It's eventually not really knowing where you are, who you are, and the most distressing of all, who your loved ones are.
Yeah, most people, I would say, are familiar with it. Unfortunately, we have relatives. In my case, I have a very close relative who has recently been diagnosed with dementia, which brings me really to my next question. What is the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's?
70% of all dementia cases are Alzheimer's disease. But you can also have dementia in other ways through, for example, damage to the frontal part of the brain, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia. There's a rather grand-sounding dementia pugilistica, which comes from fighting, where people are fighting. So the net result is the same. And I don't think one should get too hung up on the subdivisions of dementia, because really they have more in common than they have apart. And it's not until you're actually dead that people will do a post-mortem examination and get a definitive diagnosis. The really challenging issue is while you are alive, this very slow disorientation and disconnect with the real world. I too have someone very close. My own mum has it, so I know how distressing it is. And in the past, I used to say when I was lecturing on this, of course, it's toughest on the carers, because after a while, the patient themselves lacks insight. They don't realize they're like a small child, and it's tougher on the carers because the love of your life for 40 years doesn't recognize you anymore. And so whilst cancer and heart disease are serious conditions, you can still look through photos of your grandchildren. You're still the person you were. You still have the memories to share together, whereas that is denied you if you have dementia. And so I used to say that, and I used to say, and of course, it affects the carers and people don't accord them the sympathy that they should have, because they're effectively going through the stages of bereavement, because they have a sense of loss. Now, I too know personally and viscerally what that feels like, because my mum is still alive. She's 96, but she thinks my brother she changes. Is it her husband? Is it, her father? She's not sure where she is. She's not sure what a hospital is. And it is very alarming when you remember how someone used to be.
Yeah.
And you think the person that used to be would be horrified at the person they see now.
Until you experience it with a relative or a friend, I don't think you could really appreciate it. My relative, it really started with some modest symptoms, really like apathy. This person was a very active person, do-it-yourselfer, would do chores and build things and fix things, and was very responsible. And then suddenly they weren't paying their bills. They were getting collection notices. The house was getting progressively messier. They were forgetting to do things. They weren't as attentive or in touch. Conversationally, you could start to see changes, and then it only worsened over time. He's not that advanced, but it is really over the last year starting to accelerate. So let me ask you, what are some symptoms that one might look for early on that would indicate that someone is in the early stages of either Alzheimer's or dementia?
Okay, one is a problem with short-term memory. So the longer-term memories, I think people are familiar with this, are the ones that last the longest. So when my aunt had dementia, she didn't know who I was, but she remembered the name of her cat that she'd had when I was a little girl. Yeah, so because they're the most entrenched and the most solid. And the most vulnerable of the short-term memory. So you'll often find someone might repeat themselves or say the same thing twice.
Yeah.
Which can be very frustrating when you're talking to someone, because you say, yes, you just told me that. Yeah. And of course they don't understand. So that's, the next thing is a poverty of vocabulary. Now, this is rather interesting, because if someone is educated, as opposed to not being intelligent necessarily, but educated, so they have access to a wide range of words. If they lose some of them, they can sneak in other words. They have more at their disposal. So sometimes you'll find that people perhaps who have a more advanced education and access to a wider vocabulary can hide things more readily than someone who hasn't. And you'll find that people try and confabulate. They'll say, for example, oh, it's not a very nice day today. There's that water coming from the sky, because they don't have the word for rain. Or caravans, or a house with wheels. Or my mum said once, they said shields at the window, meaning shutters. So they get the vague idea, but of course there's something rather strange. And then the third thing that can happen is, and this is where you draw the line, it's when someone has behaved in a way that really is not normal. Yeah. So, for example, lawn mowing the tarmac drive outside your house. Yeah.
Right.
Putting a plastic pot on a hot hob. Yeah. Or going to London, not knowing to somewhere, this is something particular case, and not knowing why you're there, So suddenly something will happen. In my mum's case, it was a very odd thing, is that we'd been packing up after she'd been with us for the Christmas holidays, and I was packing her food, and I said, would you like some soup? And he said, oh, I don't eat soup. And I said, well, that's odd, Mum, because you had it yesterday in the hotel. Oh, I only eat soup in hotels now, which of course there's no logic to it whatsoever. Yeah,
right. They have answers.
They'll do something like that. And for me, that was, strangely enough, trivial though that sounds, that was the first. Yeah.
Yeah, my next door neighbor last year, he was an older gentleman. I think he's in his mid to late 80s. We saw him outside, buck naked.
Yeah,
just standing in front of his house.
Yeah.
And he obviously has dementia. And in my relative's case, he is completely unaware.
Well, that's the thing.
Of this.
And you have to decide when it is, and it's not an easy decision to know, is that normal? But now, obviously, being completely naked is not normal.
Yeah.
Deciding you don't want to have soup packed, but that is, it might be a bit eccentric, but it's not a sign of, huge departure from reality. Yeah. So sometimes it's very tough, because you want to fight against your loved one, thinking, well, perhaps they were just having an off day, or perhaps they forgot they didn't like soup, or, and then something happens that is categorically not right. Yeah.
So let me ask you, are there any risk factors, genetic or environmental, that would expose someone to a more, to make someone more potentially likely to have dementia or Alzheimer's?
Certainly there is a genetic, when I say it's genetic form of Alzheimer's, it's not as if there's a single gene for Alzheimer's. There's something called Huntington's chorea, which is very different, which is wild involuntary flinging the limbs in a grotesque dance-like movement. Now that does relate to a single gene. So you can be tested for Huntington's chorea and you know how likely it is you're going to pass it on or have it. Alzheimer's is not like that. In about 4 to 5% of the people that are living with Alzheimer's, that component is so-called familial, which means there is a strong genetic component, not an exclusive one, but they have a genetic profile of several genes that would distinguish them from so-called sporadic Alzheimer's, which is by far the most common.
And you can go and get yourself tested to see if
You
you
can be
have these
tested for
genes?
risk factors, but it won't guarantee that you have Alzheimer's because I say there's not a single gene. You can get yourself tested for Huntington's chorea for sure, but for Alzheimer's, it's more your genetic profile that would increase the risk of you having it. It wouldn't be a dead cert that you were going to get it.
So are there any known preventative measures that have any, meaningful impact on preventing it?
This is not my area, but someone that I want to work with and I've been talking to a lot, and I'll give you her name and you can look her up. She's in
Okay.
Australia. She's called Karin, spelled in the Scandinavian way, Kaarin, Anstey, Anstey, and she's at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. And you can check her out, and she works on risk factors and mitigating factors such as diet and so on. So rather than me second guess what she said, I refer you to, so there are people working on this, but the bottom line is just by eating blueberries, you're not going to guarantee you're going to get Alzheimer's.
Right. We'll put her name in a link if people want to look her up and
look her
get
up.
more information. Yep.
She's
Okay.
very distinguished and she's based in Australia and she works on that. I also have a view myself that exercise is very good. We know that the more you exercise, if you are able. Now, of course, you could say back, well, of course, you're an older person. Your mobility is compromised. You're not going to be able to necessarily run 10K or something. But if you can exercise, do, because we know that in older adults, people that have exercised are cognitively much more aware and alert and score much better on cognitive tests than people who have not done exercise. And exercise is good for you anyway. There's absolutely, so I would strongly suggest that. And then the other thing is something called cognitive reserve. And it's been shown that people that are living alone, perhaps not interacting with others, don't have so much, as it were, cognitive reserve in the bank. It's a bit like money in the bank. The more you're interacting with people, the more stimulated you are, the more cognitive reserve you have, which means you can spend some if you have Alzheimer's. So if you think of it as saving up mental abilities, that is helped by leading an active life where you're interacting with other people. And especially if you can move, I can't stress enough, if you can move, do. And even if you have compromised mobility, I'm sure that there's some kind of physical exercise you could do with your upper body or something. Yeah.
So you're the CEO of NeuroBio.
I am.
That's a company looking to develop a drug that can prevent and possibly treat Alzheimer's. I'll give you a chance to tell us all about that. But before we do, why don't you give us the state of the research on why don't we have a cure for Alzheimer's? Why has it been such a tough nut to crack?
Yeah. Well, there's several reasons. The first one is that it's very insidious, but Alzheimer's disease, the degeneration, the slow loss of the brain cells, that will start 10 to 20 years before you have the cognitive impairment, before you have the problems with memory.
Wow.
So heaven forfend, Jason, you or I could be sitting here now.
Yeah.
And we could be, having that happening to us. So it's not a likelihood, it's ongoing. Now, this means that eventually when someone does present with a cognitive problem, with a memory disorder, you're effectively closing the door after the horse has bolted because you've got 10 to 20 years of cell loss that's already happened, yeah. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, I'm afraid, the scientific mindset, which, contrary to what you might think, where everyone is very innovative and tries new things, we as a community are very conservative. We go with the flow. We follow other people to get grants, to get money, to get investment. You don't want to rock the boat too much. You go with the existing dogmas. And the most popular dogma is to combat something called amyloid, which I'm sure you've heard of. Amyloid, the derivation is Greek for starch, ancient Greek for starch, and these are deposits found in the brain, most typically and characteristically in postmortem Alzheimer's disease. It follows, very logically, So that, that if you combat that, then perhaps that would help. So any drug that's on the market, and in the States, it's interesting, they've been approved by your FDA, but not by our European regulation, which is a different mindset. Anything ending in ab means it's an antibody, okay? An antibody is a large protein that will actually kind of neutralize or bind to a specific target agent. It follows that developing antibodies to amyloid have been a very popular, in fact, the most popular form of treatment. And that is most recently, there's been several that have come out in the last 10 months or so, which has really revolutionized the treatment of Alzheimer's, because until then, there was no real drug. There's one called galantamine, which inhibited an enzyme that blocked a transmitter that was dwindling, so a very indirect action that didn't really work that well. But combating amyloid with these antibodies seems to be, or people seemed thought it was a great idea. Now, there's various issues with that. Well, first of all, it's better than nothing, and I want to applaud the fact that it is being used, and it shows that we are making progress. But it's far from being the Holy Grail. It's far from being the adjunct for the following reasons. One is only a few percent gets into the brain. In order to have it, you have to have intravenous administration in a hospital. And again, perhaps the difference between our two nations is that in the UK, that's very resource intensive, and on our National Health Service is something that wouldn't play out easily because of the money and the time it takes. It's also stressful, especially for someone who is in the early stages of diagnosis of dementia, to go to hospital and spend a day having an infusion. Third, you can have side effects such as brain bleeds, which are not very good. And moreover, although it does slow down the cognitive decline in the early stages of diagnosis, I'm afraid it carries on. It's not a cure. It doesn't halt the progress of the disease. And moreover, people say, you'll often read, oh, it's in the early stages of Alzheimer's. It's not. It's in the early stages of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So it could well be already 10 or 20. So for all those reasons, we need to carry on looking. But let me stress, if anyone listening to this or watching this wants access or can gain access to this drugs, far be it from me to, I'm just painting a realistic picture. It can help in early stages, but it's not going to be a miracle cure. Yeah, so that's the most popular one. And then there's, because other people look at aging-related items or something called ApoE, which in excess can give you heart attacks and high blood pressure and so on, and that in turn predisposes you to brain damage, which in turn can trigger Alzheimer's. So, so there is, and then the third reason, and this is a scientific reason, is I don't think people have really stepped back, as we like to think we have at NeuroBio, and actually say, look, well, why is this happening? Because in biology, you operate on feedback. That is to say, think of the thermostat, or the I can't think of a simple system, but it's where what happens controls it and it goes back to normal again. That's called feedback. Whereas neurodegeneration is feed forward. That's to say, something horrible happens, cells start to die, and that makes more cells die, and that makes more cells die. It doesn't switch. So it's a feed forward system, which is not normal in biology. So no one has really thought of it that way and said, well, what is this system that has gone wrong, that instead of acting as a feedback is now acting as a feed forward system? And because I was initially at the university, I was at Oxford University for a long time, so I had the leisure, if you can call it that, to stare out the stained glass windows and deal with very bright medical students in one-on-one tutorials, and just intellectually be able to just sit back and read the literature and join up the dots in a way perhaps that people in the private sector haven't been able to do. Because of that, we could ask the big questions. And one of the questions was, why? What's happening? Why? We've got to account for Alzheimer's. And the amyloid approach doesn't actually give a satisfactory narrative of how Alzheimer's happens, whereas I think we can and we do.
So why don't you talk about your company and what the technology is that you're developing and how it would work? I understand you have a patent on a blood test that can detect Alzheimer's potentially years in advance. So give us the overview of NeuroBio and why it's so exciting.
Well, thank you so much for that. So if someone had said, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, one day you're going to be CEO and founder of a biotech company, I'd have thought they were crazy, because I had a very comfortable existence as a fellow of an Oxford college and a so-called Don and a professor at Oxford, which is a very nice lifestyle, as I'm sure some of the people who watch Brideshead will be able to appreciate. I lived in college, ate on high table, have the grace in Latin and the candlelight. So very nice very nice life and very safe, a bit like Harvard and Yale is, I think, with you. Yeah. But because I had this idea, gradually it became apparent that it actually could, instead of being just an idea, it could actually be turned into a real approach that really helped people. And that excited me hugely. And I think also when you're a long time in academia, you get disillusioned with endless teaching and the routine and so on, and suddenly having this exciting possibility. And then you meet the right people who back you and help you. So the company was started in 2013 on the basis of this idea I'd had of how Alzheimer's happened. Now, because we think we understand why and how the cells are dying and what causes it, it means not only can we intercept it directly with an effective therapy, but also we can look at a readout of that process in TRAIN. And if we had a readout of that process, it means you could screen or detect it in that terrible 10 to 20 year time window before the cognitive. So this is called a pre-symptomatic biomarker. Now you can imagine the dream is that if you had a routine way of monitoring people relatively painlessly, relatively cheaply, that the problem was already underway, even though they were fine, you could then intercept with the drug, our drug that actually worked, we hope, yeah? And that would mean you'd take the drug for the rest of your life, but you'd never get the symptoms, yeah? So let me repeat, the dream of what we're doing is two things: a pre-symptomatic screen or diagnostic test that then, if it proves degeneration is already there, even though you're not aware of it, you start taking the drug that stops any more cells dying, it follows the symptoms will never come on. Yeah.
So this would be something that ideally every year when you go for your annual checkup, just like your doctor may check your cholesterol or your thyroid or your PSA, if you're a man, you would request this test.
You could do that, but you could go one better, actually. Again, I'm thinking of our country where, the resources are very limited. Yeah. What would be better, given that anyone over a certain age probably might be at risk, might be having it, yeah? Rather than wait and go to the doctor, wouldn't imagine going to your drugstore, yeah, and getting a simple screen, not that told you had it, but just told you whether or not you should go to the doctor. Yeah. So I want to be very clear about this. You would not be able to buy from the pharmacy a test saying you had Alzheimer's. But what you might be able to do, what we dream of developing, two tests. The first one would be a lateral flow, you call it an antigen test. Yes, I think, like you did for COVID and nasal. Yeah.
Right. It's like a nasal.
Whatever you call it. We call it a lateral flow test, but I think you call it an antigen test. Yeah. But it's relatively cheap and relatively painless, and people are used to it now after COVID. They're used to using it. So it's well accepted socially. People.
Yeah, of course.
So imagine having that, and you just take it whenever you want, and you just check. And if it'll be go, no go, it wouldn't be a definitive thing. It will just be go and see the doctor or you're fine. Yeah. So you might go to the doctor, get checked out further, and you're fine. That's a so-called false positive. Yeah. And that's fine. Yeah. Just no. But it might be that that's already got you at the time in that tentative, and then you'd have a more in-depth, focused, detailed, accurate test with your doctor with all the wraparound care that is needed if you're going to have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And then, so what we envisage is two stages: the lateral flow test, the home screen, because you need that, because not everyone can go to the doctor. Certainly not in the UK, they can't. The resources are a bit. So you need a funnel or a way of screening people. So on the one hand, you can screen out people that may have it, then that can be verified and evaluated by a medical practitioner. And then in an ideal world, you'd start our drug. That means, you'd never, you just take the drug for life, but you'd be as you always were, And even if you already had the diagnosis, it means that you wouldn't get any worse. So to some poor relative, who's just early stages, they still don't know you are, but they're a little bit confused. But, they're fine. It means they could take the drug and it wouldn't get any worse. That's I should stray. This is not happening tomorrow, but this is what we're aiming to do, and why we're different, I think, from other companies.
Would that test for any kind of neurodegeneration, including some of the Parkinson's, or so if you had that in your family, you can maybe see years in advance that it's starting
to. Well, if you're right, if you had it, as I said, Parkinson's is not a strong genetic. It's not like Huntington's chorea, but. There's a phrase in medicine called the worried well. If you were a worried person, if you're worried, get a test. Yeah, that would be the simple. Yeah, but I want to stress that first it wouldn't be a definitive diagnosis. It would be a way of screening you to go and get further medical attention or testing. And at the same time, it's not happening tomorrow, but foreseeable if we can progress this. I think we're different from others because, as I said, we've challenged the dogma of amyloid, not without opposition, of course, yeah. But at the same time, we're very excited by this because it's like a jigsaw puzzle. The more we do, the more it seems to be validated and coming together.
Well, I mean, it sounds like an incredible product in the market that would be very novel. And if everyone had access to it and it was, I'm assuming, relatively affordable, you would think who wouldn't want to
Exactly.
take advantage of this. And from the perspective of a business perspective, shall we say, it seems like an incredible opportunity.
Oh, from a business, it's worth huge because it will
Yeah.
be a first in class, as they say. It's not as if we're designing an alternative football sock or something, it's or alternative Hankney wrinkle cream or, there is nothing else there at the moment. Yeah. As far as I know.
The global demand for something like that, I would imagine, would be absolutely incredible. But that's only, like you said, half of what it is that you guys are working on. Why don't you talk about the actual therapeutic or preventative component?
Okay, so I'll try and talk in non-specialist language. Yeah, forgive me if I use jargon, but do look at our website. And for anyone who is technical, the Alzheimer's Society Journal of America in May published a review article authored not just by us, but externally by 3 Alzheimer clinicians. So the first author is Garcia Rates. So if you're a technical person, you can check that out in the journal Alzheimer's and Dementia, which you can download it. It's a free, so that will give you the technical overview of what we do. But I'll now try and explain it. I'll try and explain, Jason, 40 years of my life in a few sentences. Okay, so okay, so there's various clues, and let's start with the clues. What's really interesting, and people have ignored, apart from when I was at Oxford and I was just staring out the window and I thought about it, is there are certain groups of brain cells that are primarily vulnerable. These are groups of brain cells that will show degeneration very early on, before you have the cognitive symptoms. And these cell groups do not contain amyloid. Yeah. So therefore, amyloid can't be the primary target. It can't be, because it's let's say it's not irrelevant, but it would be a downstream component. Okay. So what's special about these? If we knew more about these primarily vulnerable cells, then obviously we might have a handle on how Alzheimer's happens and why it happens. Second thing we need to know is these primarily vulnerable cells, during your development, they come from a different part of the embryo. So as early as 4 weeks in the womb, when the brain is very primitive, it's in 2 layers. And most brain cells are in this upper layer, but the primarily vulnerable cells come from this lower layer. Now, in genetics and development, as soon as you have differentiation at such an early stage, it should tell you they are fundamentally different, the cells. Somehow they've got different properties because they've differentiated, they've become separated at a very early stage. And for me, a light bulb moment was written by someone called Nancy Wolfe at UCLA, one side of the pond, and this was in the 90s. And I was sitting there and suddenly I had this exciting connection because what she was showing in her review, and she hadn't realized herself, was that these primarily vulnerable cells not only were the first ones that are lost in neurodegenerative conditions, but they had other properties that gave us a clue as to why that was the case. And the main property that struck me, and this sounds paradoxical, is that these brain cells, unlike other brain cells, have retained their sensitivity for growth. That's to say they're stimulated by growth factors. They're able to grow again, yeah? Now, you might think, well, that sounds fantastic. That sounds like a really good thing, surely. But the problem is that what can be very welcome in a developing system, it's like Jekyll and Hyde, can be toxic in a mature system because the context has changed, okay? And the trigger for growth in a mature system, in an immature system, can actually turn toxic if that same mechanism operates, yeah? So this made me think, well, perhaps neurodegeneration is an inappropriate form of development. It somehow in the mature brain, now we're in the adult brain, if there is something that triggers these vulnerable cells to try and grow again, this time is going to be terrible. It's going to be toxic because it's the context of a mature brain. Okay, so what kind of things could happen? Well, anything. Could be a blow to the head. It could be a local stroke. And we know that people suffering in sports injuries with blows to the head and boxing have more. Could be that. It could be a decline in protective mechanisms against these kind of molecular Rambos called free radicals. I'm sure many people have heard of free radicals. These gnaw away at the... so it could be that. It doesn't really matter. But can you imagine if you have damage to the brain generally, you can have recovery like during a stroke. If for whatever reason these vulnerable cells are damaged, okay, this time they have retained their ability to grow again. So what they're going to try and do, they'll put into play a feedback system. They will try now and restore and retaliate by growing. But this time, because it's the context of a mature brain, it'll be a snowball effect, be the very worst that could happen. And so you'll have neurodegeneration. Now, this theory that we have explains why you have the 10 to 20 year time window, because the primarily vulnerable cells are very basic cells with a high degree of redundancy. That means to say you can have a lot of damage before you see any, but they all take over from each other. And because they're very primitive cells, they're not affecting memory or sophisticated higher functions. So your function just normal, but they are. What you can have is perhaps problems with mood or arousal levels, with sleep, because they underlie very basic functions. So we see neurodegeneration as an aberrant form of development triggered, because these cells are special. So then you say, well, what is the agent that would normally cause development that now has turned toxic and is being dangerous? How can we identify that? And for 40 years of my life, I've been working on a chemical that has a very familiar role in biology, but my big thing was to show it had a second role and act as a sort of agent in this second role. And this not evil, but this agent that can be both a developmental factor, but also lethal, that is derived from that agent. And that's throughout the vulnerable cells. So we identified, it's called T14, if people want to, I'll close it. And so this is a peptide for people that like chemistry. It means it's 14 amino acids. Called T14. And T14 we have identified as being common in the vulnerable cells and being highest during development and being recapitulated in the Alzheimer brain. We've shown it is doubled in the Alzheimer brain, so we know that this is, and we believe, and our data shows, I won't get into this, is that this could actually drive the process of degeneration. Okay, so that lends itself to two things. First, T14, we can now measure it, we hope, in nasal secretions, hence it would be used for lateral flow, or in saliva. We can measure it in cerebral spinal fluid. That's the fluid that bathes the brain and spinal cord, which is used in lumbar punctures, and possibly in blood, but that is more remote from the brain. So we're working on a pre-symptomatic test that would be relatively painless.
So when you take that nasal swab at-home test you were describing earlier, that you're looking for T14
That's the plan.
levels.
That would be the plan. Yes, exactly.
Right. Okay.
And then you want the medication, obviously. And this is again where it's been approved as novel. So equivalent to your FDA, we have in the UK the MHRA, which is our regulatory body. Mm-hmm. And they have at least accredited the first stage that this drug that we're developing is truly novel. We've got this passport of innovation, so called, but it's not available yet for people because we've tested it in rats. And what it is and why it's novel is, and we're quite pleased with ourselves on this, it's the evil T14, but simply bent out of shape, so-called cyclated. So that's to say we've taken the 14 amino acid string, bent them out of shape. It's a bit like tying your hands behind your back. So now what it will do, it will compete with the naturally occurring linear version that's in the brain, displace it. So it's a bit like knocking someone off their seat, but your hands are tied behind your back. So having knocked someone off their seat, they can't do anything, but you can't either because your hands are tied behind your back. So it's a very simple, and we call that NeuroBio peptide 14, NBP14. And so far in an animal model of Alzheimer's, it's ensured that the memory for object recognition in a very standard animal model of Alzheimer's, that whilst the controls, their memory is shot to pieces, the animals given our drug intranasally twice a week for 14 weeks, they performed at the level of normal animals, wild type animals. So, and they also had no amyloid. So we're very encouraged by that. And what we're doing now is hoping to get the funds and take it through the regulatory stages for FDA approval and so on, so that we can enter so-called phase 1 clinical trials, which, as I'm sure you know, are trials simply that show that you do no harm, that is, you don't break out in hives or have terrible side effects. Yeah. So we would hope to do that within a year or two. So that's where we are. Yeah.
If anyone out there is interested in investing
Oh,
or
yes, please.
participating, I'm assuming you would like them to just reach
very
out
much
to
so,
you.
yes.
I mean,
Yeah,
it
I'd love
sounds
to hear
like a
from you.
great opportunity on both fronts. And so I assume you've developed some sort of antagonist to T14, and that's the
That's the
drug you're trying to...
MVP14, yes. Yeah, exactly. So we actually have 20 patent families now, which covers not just the biomarker readout and also the MVP14, but we have a pipeline now of drugs of different types, not different types, but variations on that theme. So little bits of it and so on, which we're testing in-house so that we're refining, getting better all the time. But MVP14 is our prototype drug and our first one. So it's a bit like a biplane, and then eventually we'd like Concorde, but at least it will fly if we're using that analogy, you know? And
how far away from commercialization would you say you are on the test product?
Well, for the test, that's easy because no one dies giving a nasal swab.
Right.
So that is an easier thing to develop and test in humans. I'd like to think, again, it all depends on funds and so on, but within 1 or 2 years, well, certainly within a year, I could be holding here a lateral flow kit and saying, we've been given a 6-month quote for developing the actual kit, yeah. To validate it, to show that it is a go, no-go, and will take, say, a further year. The drug will take a year to go through the regulatory stages to get to phase 1, so about 2 years. So within 3 years, we could be in a much stronger position than we are now.
And you're talking specifically UK right now?
No. One of our investors was the US. No, we're very, and Australia. No, and that's why when we do get to the clinical stage, we'll make applications to the FDA.
Wow. Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. Like we were saying, we both have relatives, and most of us know people dealing with this issue and how painful it is and what an awful thing it is, and anything that shows hope to prevent it or slow it down, hopefully stop it, hopefully eventually eliminate it, like polio, just never have to worry about this again. That would be a dream.
That your grandchildren, rather like we say to our grandparents now, was polio ever a problem? And of course it's all. Was smallpox, was that ever a problem? And of course, these are still serious conditions, but they're completely contained. I'd like to think your grandchildren would say, so was it ever really a problem, Alzheimer's? I'm taking this nasal spray and I'm having this routine test. Yeah, I'm fine.
So, Professor, are there any final thoughts before we wrap up? Any final things that our audience should know?
Yeah. Well, first of all, look at our website, NeuroBio, NEURO-bio, which I hope there's a little film on it showing our theory for the general. Yeah. If anyone's got any queries, of course, we'd love to hear from them. I'm not a practicing medic, so I can't give clinical advice, but I can give scientific insights and explanations if that would be helpful to people. And if, of course, anyone was interested in investing, then of course, but I'd like to not sound mercenary. If people just are interested, I'm delighted to answer emails.
Of course. And I'll put a link below down to the website. You could check out NeuroBio, and it really is fascinating and could be a great opportunity. So be sure to do that. Dr. Greenfield, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jason. It was a pleasure. Thank you for the platform. Thank you.
Really appreciate your time.
Okay. Take care.